G'day, Geoff Lewis here from Seriously Series, and welcome to another episode of Servicing Your 4x4. What we're going to be looking at today is suspension, primarily looking at the actual springs that hold up the vehicles that we all know and love. Now, this here is obviously a leaf spring, and we're going to be looking primarily at the suspension system used in a series Land Rover. But whether you have leaf springs, coil, or independent, or torsion bar suspension, pretty much all the principles that underline these different sorts of suspension systems are basically exactly the same. So I'm going to show you some tips and tricks how you can get more out of your suspension system, get it to last longer, get it to be easier to service, and some of the tips and tricks that you need to keep an eye out for along the way. If you're keen to learn and find out more, then you know what to do, don't you? Stay tuned. So suspension is a subject area that's been discussed, debated, argued about in regards to the off-road going vehicle really since time began. And it's funny because pretty much everything in a vehicle has started off with one idea. A great way to think about it is the wheel. You know, someone went out in Persia and they got a chisel and a bit of initiative and they made this spherical thing, and then they put an axle through it. And now today we've got all different kinds of wheels that you can get. You can get some made out of rubber, steel, concrete, whatever it may be. So it really all starts with one idea, and it's very much the same in regards to suspension. Now, horse and cart is really where it all started. We had the 4-Up, which is the famous wagon of the West. You know, any Western movie worth its salt will have one of these in it. Outlaw Josie Wales is a good one to watch with Clint Eastwood. There's a few fantastic John Wayne westerns to watch there too. So if you don't know what one of those are, you need to watch one of those films. Great way to spend a Sunday afternoon. But basically the problem that was faced with suspension is we started getting motorised transport, particularly steam vehicles, and then moving on into the internal combustion era when we started getting petrol engines and diesel and all the rest. And they were moving faster and faster and faster. The primary job of your suspension system is obviously to be able to level out or take out the bumps and the undulation in the terrain. And this is really, really important. You've got to understand that and appreciate that before we can move forward. Without suspension, you've got nothing to actually dampen the blow of the bumps, the humps and all the rest that you're going to be travelling over. And because the vehicles that we use are made out of metal, this causes a huge amount of metal fatigue to actually occur on your vehicle and on the chassis itself. What is metal fatigue? Well, this is basically tiny little cracks that occur in your chassis or other components in the vehicle. And this can actually get so bad that it can actually cause components to actually shatter and snap. An example of this is some of the swivel hubs, which I'll just run off and get one. Right, here's one I prepared earlier. So this is a swivel hub, and your front wheel sits on here and it articulates that way, or that way with the steering of your steering wheel. But metal fatigue, just to use this as an example, can occur right around here. And I think you get where I'm going with this. It ends up cracking and this whole thing breaks off and your whole front wheel is moving independently of the vehicle. So that's something to really, appreciate the fact that having good suspension set up for the load that you're carrying is absolutely vital. And it's the whole point of why we have suspension in a vehicle. So really, really important. So anyway, now that we understand that, we can move on a little bit further on down the track. Now, leaf springs have been around since probably the Victorian era, you could probably argue. It's a really, really simple system, very robust, very, very durable. And one of the fantastic things about leaf suspension is that you can actually modify it quite easily. Now, I'm going to run through what actually a leaf suspension is made up of. Why am I going to do that? Because I've come across situations in the last few years where I thought something was very, very simple, very well known in the greater world, and it isn't. So that's why I'm doing this. I'm not trying to teach you how to suck eggs. It's just we need to go through this so everyone can understand what we're talking about. So what actually makes up a leaf spring? Well, in the case of a series Land Rover, we've got a centre bolt here. What's a centre bolt? Well, use your powers of deduction and you'll probably get pretty close. It's actually a bolt that sits in the centre of the leaf pack. That makes sense? It does. And this is a bolt that goes all the way through. You've got a nut on top and it actually helps to compact the spring pack. But it also serves another very, very useful purpose. In the actual axle housing itself on a series Land Rover, you have a tiny little hole, and this bolt actually has to fit into that hole. So it actually helps the leaf spring to become located with the actual axle assembly itself, right? So you can imagine what happens when one of these breaks. Yes, you've got other components actually holding it to the axle assembly itself, but you've got nothing to actually stop the leaves actually moving laterally backwards or forwards as you hit the bumps and the humps and all the rest. So it's really, really important. Now, I've come across a number of situations in the last few years where I've gone to reputable businesses and I've said I just want a centre bolt. And one of these was a trailer specialist and he looked at me blankly. And he wasn't a man of junior years, he was someone who'd been around the block a few times, but he, for the life of him, had not heard what a centre bolt is. And it just goes to show we don't know everything. So, you know, that's why we have to do this, and it's a bit of a bee in my bonnet, you could say. But anyway, that is a centre bolt. So you need to be mindful that not everyone knows what a centre bolt is. It is a special bolt in itself because the head is actually a lot different to your typical hex head bolt. It's a lot thicker. And I'll show you a picture of one here just to give you a bit of context. Now, if you're stuck out in the bush or you're stuck out on a track and you've actually snapped one of these, you can replace them. You can actually use a standard hex head bolt. You'll need a file or a grinder, and then you'll actually need to grind it down so it actually fits in the axle assembly. And that'll get you out of trouble anyway. Now, the next thing that's really important with your leaf pack is a bush. And I'm not talking about a bush as in the plant sense. I'm talking about this thing that I've been waving around in my hand. The problem that we have is this is obviously taking a huge amount of impact as we're going across corrugations and all the rest. But the problem is if we put in these eyelets here a steel bolt or steel all the way through, some component of some kind, then what's going to happen? Well, none of the shock's going to be absorbed, is it? So basically how a suspension bush works is very, very simple. You've got this outer tube here that you can see, right? And that sits in the eyelet of the spring, and then you've got this internal cylinder here. Now this is where the actual bolt goes through to actually bolt the spring to the spring hanger or to the chassis of the vehicle. Oh no, this one I haven't done that yet. But basically what will happen over time, and this is something, a little top tip you need to be careful of, this rubber will perish. And if you're buying a series Land Rover or a 75 series or any vehicle that's actually got leaf springs, this is what you want to look for. because what will happen is as the rubber perishes and becomes brittle, it'll slowly get pushed out, and you will see this almost like a string of rubber actually coming out from the internals in here. And that can tell you that your suspension bushes are stuffed and they actually need replacing. Stuff is a technical term here. The other thing that you want to look for is when you're getting new suspension bushes or even old suspension bushes is to make sure that the actual internal cylinder is actually in the center. Because what can happen is you can get a defect and it can actually be sitting down a little bit or up a little bit. And that'll mean that it isn't going to last very long because you've got less rubber in contact with the internal cylinder and the outer edge. The other thing that'll happen over time is because you've got force going up, it's actually going to wear around the top here, and you'll actually get this sitting on top of this here. Oh, it's not sitting on top, but sitting on the edge. And therefore your suspension bush won't actually work effectively. Now, you can go for polyurethane bushes. I've used them in the Series 2, the Series 3. They're very, very effective. They're fantastic. You can actually put grease in there to actually lubricate them and all the rest. However, the actual density of the rubber is much different compared to that of the standard bushes used in the Series Land Rover. So if you are going to use polyurethane bushes, just use it with a side of caution. They're fantastic. They're really easy to actually change. And I'll talk about why they're so easy to change in a moment. So that's basically a suspension bush in a nutshell. Now, the other thing that we need to look at if we want to actually get our leaf springs up and going again is we might actually want to lubricate them. And this actually makes a big difference. You can do a couple different things here. Now, you can put oil in between the leaves, you can put grease in between the leaves, and you can put graphite powder in between the leaves. Now, I've done all three, and I'll tell you which one I think is the most effective. If you're going to use grease, one of the problems that you'll have is everything that you drive over is going to stick to it. Fur, mud, grit, dust, whatever it may be. And a lot of people think that this is going to wear away your leaf springs. Well, it can do in severe circumstances. Back in the day, what you would do is you would use a gaiter, and these were made out of leather, and you would actually encase the entire leaf spring in leather, wrapping it round and binding the leather round it. So it acted as a cocoon almost and protected it from the outside world. The same applies if you're going to use oil. But one of the best things I think is using graphite powder. Now, people are going to say at this point, Geoff, you're wrong because it just washes straight out. Well, it doesn't. If you look at how compact your actual leaf pack is, it's impossible for water to get in there. It's impossible for water to get out on the outer edges. I've pulled leaf springs apart that I put graphite powder in 10 years ago, and I've looked at the surface and the graphite powder's still there. The great thing about graphite powder is unlike oil, it doesn't have that sticky nature, so nothing sticks to it. So it just makes it much, much easier to work on your vehicle underneath. So I'd really recommend doing that. Now, if you do decide to actually pull the whole leaf pack apart, there's a couple other things you need to keep in mind too. You've got these clamps here and here. Now, what you can do, and I've done this before too, is you can heat these up, straighten them out, and then you can pull the whole leaf pack apart. Now, if you're going to do that, you need to be careful, because if you heat these up and you bend them back down, you may damage the temperament of the steel. And Damon's actually seen this happen to a set of leaves that we were going to put in the Series 3, and the spring right that we took them to, he just got a cold chisel and he just went tap on the top, and this is thick steel, and they just shattered. So you really need to be careful with that. If you are going to pull your leaf springs apart, you are going to pull the actual clamps apart too, I would recommend going to a spring right and actually either fitting a new set of clamps yourself or getting them to fit them for you too. So that's probably all that. Oh no, there's one more top tip. I'm nearly done. Oh, where the fuck? So one of the problems we have using older vehicles is wear and tear. And if you imagine this is a leaf spring, a bit crude, but over time as it bends and flexes, these outer edges wear thin, and they actually wear grooves into the actual leaf itself. Now this means that you'll actually get ridge marks in the leaf itself, and this means it won't actually be able to slide over the leaf nice and easily when it's actually wanting to flex and bend. Now some of the methods you can actually use are a bit crude. You can actually get a grinder and you can just grind this off and actually smooth it out a little bit, but I really think if you're pulling a leaf pack apart and it's that badly worn, you're better off replacing the whole leaf pack itself. It's really not worth it, because if you're making that leaf even thinner than it already is, then you're just really inviting recipe for disaster, because that's going to cause more fatigue to occur across that plane, and at some point in time you're actually going to get a snapped leaf spring. So if you're using it for a farm bus or a bit of a knock-around vehicle, it's probably okay if you do that. But if you really want to get a good vehicle up and running and to be able to do some serious adventures, I'd recommend just going and get an entire new leaf or an entire new leaf pack. Rightio, so that's pretty much everything about the leaf spring that you need to know. Now, what about if you're going to install suspension components in your vehicle? Now this is something that applies to all suspension systems. One of my pet peeves is when I come across a new vehicle that I've bought, and I'm trying to get the suspension bush out, or bushes out, and I've noticed that someone hasn't put any grease in it. What do you mean? Well, it's very simple. If you put anti-seize grease, particularly copper anti-seize grease, which I find to be the best, on your actual suspension bush, just smear it on and knock it into your leaf spring, you'll find that even in 20-30 years time you'll be able to get a socket and just tap 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 and knock that straight out, a piece of cake. How do I know this? Because I've done it. My Series 2, a good friend of mine, George, he put new suspension bushes back in the mid-1980s, and about probably 7 years ago I actually replaced all the bushes in the vehicle because they just had it. And when I knocked them out, I could still see the smear of copper anti-seize grease on the bolts and on the actual bushes themselves. Because it's important, because what actually happens is moisture does get in there and it causes the outer casing to actually become infused with the spring itself. The bolt can also seize, or actually seize pretty much with the inner tube of your bush itself, and with movement over time and obviously the rubber perishing, it can actually end up twisting and moving independently, and it just destroys the bush itself. And when you're trying to actually get it all apart, there's nothing you can do but cut the bolt and go and buy a brand new bolt. So you really want to do that. And that pretty much applies to any vehicle. If you're using a coil sprung vehicle, you want to do it for all your bushes there. If you're using an independent front or rear suspension vehicle, you want to use it for all the bushes there. It just makes it so much easier. Anyway, so that's pretty much leaf springs in a nutshell. One of the other things that you need to look at is, we'll hop under the Series 2 and I'll tell you a little bit about why you need to know about this and how it makes a big difference. Rightio. So one of the things you really need to keep an eye on is your U-bolts. So obviously when you put the spring in, you locate the axle assembly with the center bolt, which can be a bit of a pain. You then put your tighten up your U-bolts, which go through your spring plate. And then once it's in the vehicle, you don't just forget about it, you need to service it regularly. You need to check the tension of your U-bolts. If your U-bolts actually become loose, they're not made out of high tensile steel or anything that's really that fancy. They're pretty crude when you think about it.
So if they become loose, or if your vehicle's carrying too much of a load, they can actually snap. So it's really well worthwhile, if you are going to go to the trouble of pulling your suspension apart, make sure you actually replace your U-bolts with brand new ones. It's just not worth the hassle. The other thing too, if you're doing a big trip, I'd suggest carry a couple of these, because I actually snapped a few when I did the Canning stock route. So you just want to get underneath and just check them every couple of days or so. You don't have to put more tension on them, but you just want to check them, make sure that they're nice and firm, nice and tight, and they're not coming loose.
Well, that about sums it up. And I think I've talked well and truly long enough about the leaf spring suspension system and suspension systems in general. And congratulations to getting this far through the video. You're obviously a die-hard off-road going enthusiast. But anyway, hopefully there's been a few tips and tricks that you've found of use yourself. And look, if that is a particular area that you're a little bit unsure of in regards to servicing your own 4x4, then feel free to put a question in the comment section down below. If you are enjoying the content here at Seriously Serious, then please do consider supporting us via Patreon. And if Patreon isn't your cup of tea, then you can support us via our website by clicking on the link in the content section down below. And if you're new to the channel and you're just trying to figure out who we are, what we do and all the rest, then click on that subscribe button down below, click on the notification button too, and that way you won't miss out on one single video. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in our next video.